Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in. This series of interviews that centers around this book, Readings of the Gateless Barrier. We have many contributors to this volume, and all the contributors will be interviewed by eminent scholars in our field. So I'm very happy today that we have Paul Kopp, my good friend and colleague, uh, conversing with me. Paul is a historian of Buddhism and Chinese religion, um, whose work really centers on material culture as much as ideas and text. He received his PhD from Princeton University when we were there together, and is currently associate professor and chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilization at University of Chicago. So his first book is entitled The Body Incantatory: Spells and Ritual Imagination of Medieval Chinese Buddhism. I'm very happy to hear it's published by Columbia University Press. Very happy to hear that he's working on a second book, The Ritualist's Seal: Object, Practice, and Knowledge in China from 100 to 1000 CE. So you can find out more about his work on the website, the faculty page website at Chicago. And really looking forward to his second book. I use his book to teach in my Chinese religion seminar for grad students. So Paul, let's start the conversation.
Yeah, well, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me to do this. I'm really looking forward to it. I really like this book. I've used it in my classes, and I'm glad to have a little, chance to be part of it in a sense, right? The sort of greater world of the book. I actually, just as a personal note, just last night I finished typing the last sentence on the last chapter of rough draft of the new book. So I'm pretty excited about it.
Excellent.
Still a long way from being on anyone's shelf if that ever happens. But anyway, exciting for me. So
Please submit it. Please submit it to the Shenyang series.
oh, okay. Thank you.
Well, we're always open to receiving anything from you.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Um, so I thought we'd just begin in a general way. Um, with you, and you're the editor of the book, both the editor of the book and a contributor to the book. You wrote the introduction. And I should say, too, that the introductions to the whole series of these books, every book in the series, has been very useful. They're all very well done and very useful. And yours, you know, also, I rereading it for this conversation, I just saw, how helpful it is. And you also give your own a kind of picture of the history of Buddhism, right? That helps to see the Gateless Barrier, right, as fully a part of that history. So I'm grateful for that. But if we could start just about you, I mean, if you could just tell us a little bit about your own background, how you got, these are the usual questions, right? How did you get interested in Buddhism, right? And how did you, what followed from that, I guess.
Okay. So, I think like many of us, when we were young, we really got into different alternative outlooks on life and spiritual traditions and so on. So, I, being a part of a Buddhist family, was exposed to meditation, Chan, and so on. So, began quite young, and then met my teacher, meditation teacher, Master Shen Yan, when I was about 11, and went through my crazy phase, punk rock, metal, and all that stuff. He witnessed all that, skinheads. And after college, the first year of college, I started doing intensive retreat with him. And then actually after college, I became one of his attendant monks. Um, in the West, it was his only attendant monk. And did that about a decade. And after that, I basically didn't know what else to do. I could basically only do Buddhism. So I thought maybe I should go to grad school. So that's how I entered grad school. So I studied with Dan Stevenson at KU because he also studied with Master Sheng when he was at Columbia University as a grad student. So we've kept in contact. So I just applied there and just studied with him. And after that, went to Princeton where I met you. And we went through the program together. And then towards that, it was kind of um, towards the end of Master Sheng's life. And that's when I had thought that I'm just going to do academia the rest of my life. That's when I thought, it would be a shame not to share some of his teachings to me with others, in the realm of Dharma practice. And so as a part of my way to repay my gratitude to him, I thought I'll just start a small meditation group. So when I came to Florida here, I started a group, and he passed away. I went back to the funeral, and that's when it really shifted. And I thought, I'm going to do academia, yes, it's where I get my salary, support my family, and then I'm going to just offer myself to share what I've learned. So that kind of these two tracks, and I've always kind of kept it hidden because in the Dharma world, I'm Guagu. In the academia, I'm Jimmy Yu. Until I got tenure, and I thought, you know what? I don't really care. I'll just. So I started teaching. Started a course called Chan Zen Buddhism course, scrambling different sources, academic sources, and then later on. So I've always kind of tried to balance the two in my academics teaching circles. And then later on, Buzzy, Stephen Tizer, the series editor, contacted our advisor, Princeton, contacted me to see if I want to edit. He must have heard through the grapevine that I'm doing these two things. I remember one time at one of the AAR conferences, he says, Jimmy, what is this thing that you're doing with the Dharma, teaching Dharma? You're keeping separate. He says, it's like Jekyll and Hyde. You got to bring them together. And I thought, okay. So he asked me to edit this volume. And then I thought, this is a good opportunity. Like a revised, updated version of Kenneth Craft's book, Zen Tradition and Transition, where he kind of had teachers of Zen plus academics of Zen, you know, sharing different perspectives. And I thought that approach was really good, and that's what led to this book. A kind of three-dimensional, holistic um, understanding from different angles, introduced for college students. That's what the book targeted audience. But of course, the general public will love it too. University setting. So the students who take classes on Zen, as you know, they probably have some kind of personal interest in Buddhism or something. So I wanted to give them different perspectives, from practitioner teachers and academics. So that's what this book, a little bit about me and how we came to this book.
Yeah, it's a powerful story. I think there are others. There are many other really academics who sort of have these two sides, But you mentioned Dan Stevenson, myself certainly. Pardon me. But I don't think anyone has quite the same high profile in both that you do. I mean, Buzzy said Jekyll and Hyde. I was going to say like Bruce Wayne and Batman or something. But but are there and this we see it in the book, and all this is sort of moving toward discussing the book, of course. The book, as you say, combines these approaches. But I wonder if in your own work now, post tenure, that you're sort of publicly, I guess, owning up. to both of them in a way that Bruce Wayne and Batman never do, bring them together. Is there a way that, one sort of feeds into the other? Does in your own thinking and teaching, I mean, are they separate? Or is there a way that, you know, the that they are either being brought together or they at least shape each other in some way? I wonder.
Yeah, long story. I could say a lot, but I'm going to limit myself. Personally, in the introduction, I spoke about three paths of Buddhism for the general public. It's actually related to your question. The path of abandonment type of Buddhism talks about samsara is here, you gotta get rid of it, and go to nirvana. And the path of transformation. Oh, samsara is nirvana. This is the playground, bodhisattva. This is where we work out all our issues and perfect all the qualities. And then Chan, the path of recognition, exposing our true nature and so on. That exposing part is actually what I link for myself, the commonality between academia and my practice. By academia, I mean like critical thinking. You know how when we're trained, just critically read, scholarly work and be able to identify thesis, be able to see through the construct of how the argument is made, the sources used, the questions asked, the implications. That kind of transparency, that that's where I link it to my own practice because I mean it's one way and it's a very important way because when we kind of go rewire our brain to go through the training of PhD to kind of do this kind of critical thinking, critical writing, critical reading, and then we can easily kind of about different discourses and then reverting the light on ourselves on how we create our narratives and construct and sources and implications. That kind of exposing is a process of accepting and embracing ourselves and the beginning of transforming and letting go. So that being able to see through the, selfing and othering from the Buddhist realm, that's what they would call it, uh, to the academic realm of, narratives. That's our bread and butter, writing, narratives, words and language. Be able to just kind of see through that. That's how I link the two. How it manifests, I kind of stress that in my teaching at FSU. Um, but in terms of subject of my research, yeah, yeah, I've been hiding, kind of Jekyll and Hyde for so long, Paul. I mean, I've been here like 17 years, I think. It's just in recently, when I kind of started to think about doing this book and that I really try to kind of owning up or something because there's such a bias, as you know, not so much in like late antiquity studies or Islamic studies, but in Chan Zen studies. Oh my goodness, we have a DT Suzuki, and everyone wants to kill him, kill the father, and it's just so much criticism of, oh, you're an insider, or you're not objective. So this really like 19th century Victorian notion of objectivity still kind of lingers around in our field. Um, Not so much in other religious studies field, but just, in Buddhist studies, particularly Chan Zen studies. So I really didn't want to, deal with that. So, I mean, in hiding. So the subject matter of our research had never really been, close at heart. So the first book, Self-Inflicted Violence, Chinese religion. Like I study Chinese religion, no one will have anything to say about my objectivity. Ming Dynasty stuff. The second book that began to have, the second book happened a lot, many years later, was my book on Shen Yan, Master Shen Yan, my teacher. Originally, I just wanted to publish a small, thin book. And then it just kind of grew, the project just grew. I couldn't help myself when I started to unpack some of the stuff. And I got some kind of bounce back, when I presented parts of the paper at AAR, and people start to kind of, before even, reading the substance or my presentation, they already had these ideas about, oh, he's a practitioner. So I never really brought it into my subject of study until now. This third one, I just thought I'm gonna kind of start to bridge the two. So I'm just beginning this process, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah. Well, and we'll talk about where it has gone in this particular book,
Yeah,
and it's gone in pretty fruitful ways. It's interesting. I don't want to. We could spend the whole time talking about the issues that you just brought up, and they're important ones and difficult ones. But maybe in sort of bending the conversation toward the book a little bit, in other or I'm thinking at least of the volume in this series on the Platform Sutra. It engages the work of philosophers, right? I mean, there are philosophers who study Buddhism, but people, Brooks Zipporah, I'm thinking of, who I don't want to speak for him, but I understand him to see himself as a philosopher, in many ways primarily, and so philosophers are able, and it's completely fine, right, to engage the ideas of these books, whether the Platform Sutra or the Umenguan, the Gateless Barrier, right? Wholly seriously, and to engage them as living things, right? As ideas that can be right or can be wrong, and that you should engage on that level. So we've seen a little bit of that, right, in some of these other volumes. But in this volume, as editor, you made the bold choice, the helpful choice, I would say, of including not only people like us as we're presenting each other, ourselves on this, in this podcast for the most part, but people who are practitioners, right? Zen teachers,
yeah,
American. They're both Americans, I think.
yeah,
American Zen teachers, and so in a sense, I don't want to go too far with this, but you're the kind of two-track Jekyll and Hyde. Jekyll and Hyde sounds bad. Jekyll and Hyde vision of studying the tradition, right? The texts that you have been wrestling with in your own life, in your own work. That's here in the book, right? Not as an object of anxiety or anything, but as a productive conversation, right? And I wonder if you could, to begin to get us into the book, talk a little bit about that, right? About, how I think we maybe know, Philip, generally why you did it at this point. You've been talking about your career, but what you thought it would do, right? What you think the book is doing by including, Jan Chozen Bays and Meido Moore, along with the other, the more straight, sort of academic people in the book. What are you doing there?
yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Well, basically, like I said, I wanted to first introduce to the readers these multiple dimensions of many of these cases in the Gateless Barrier. There are 48 cases, and the different readings of it. Because the two camps of practitioners and scholars, they tend to not talk to each other. So, and each camp has its own genealogy of how to read this text, or for the practitioners, how to practice this text. And and that's the first. aim is really to kind of bridge the two so they see each other's work and for the readers to understand the multi-dimensional ways you can read these texts, like many of the chapters, historical, which is primarily my chapter, chapter two. So there are two chapters on historical. There are two chapters on kind of philosophical approaches, um, which I think will benefit the practitioners, but they're trained not to philosophical, forget that, not depend on words and language, we can't do that. But these insights are very helpful, right? To kind of reshape, to loosen up the rigidity of how, people tend to think, either you're a practitioner or scholar, right? And then two chapters on kind of cultural perspectives, gender, mythological, and kind of the working and the practice, how um, teachers teach the Gateless Barrier. What is the place in their, for lack of a better term, curriculum of ringside Zen training? So that's the first thing, for the introduce for the readers and for two camps to talk to each other or to see each other's work. Another aim I wanted to do really is to um, present uh, an entryway or introduce a kind of a platform. Because the reality is, unlike say 20 years ago, you know, now practitioners and Dharma teachers are starting to tap into the wellspring, the reservoir of treasury of academic study of Buddhism. And for us, East Asian Buddhism, the Japanese Zen, they're looking to kind of Zen studies. So they're really drawing from that. And I think that's good because this platform will provide them with the historical context of how, for example, this work have changed, shifted throughout the centuries. And historical context determine the content and the practice, as you know, like Shakyamuni Buddha's time, he catered to the disposition of people, the karmic propensity. So he kind of taught extemporaneously. But all teachings are like that. Same teaching, how it evolved, how it's practiced. To understand that history is so important for Dharma teachers and practitioners. And I really want them to understand that, you know, so that they will be able to respond. This is maybe it's very naive, but respond to our own historical context, 21st century, to see the need to modify, you know, to adapt. Um, Earlier generations of Zen teachers, they really kept in the West. They really kept to the tradition. If you're Soto Zen, Dogen. If you're Rinzai Zen, Hakuin, maybe Torei and some other people, and just stick to that. Um, and the forms of the practice is also kind of stuck in that way. So understanding the historical changes and shifts is good for Dharma teachers and practitioners. And for scholars, you know, they may criticize the Dharma teachers for not understanding the history and the actual context and like textual discourse context of that. But but the living tradition. I mean, this book is so different than other books in the series of Buddhist classics. Um, the readings of Lotus Sutra, readings of Vesantara, readings of Platform Sutra is so different because this book, Gateless Barrier, people are actually using it. They're actually embodying it. So, I mean, that is part of the history as it's happening. So I want the historians, the scholars to actually see that and maybe even use that, like the two chapters to understand how it's unfolding. Um, so there may be other reasons that hidden from my own conscious mind that I'm not even aware of it now, but just
Yeah, you can lay down. Maybe we'll do a little psychoanalysis or something. But what's really? Sorry. I mean, it's great, right? Especially for teaching, I would say, teaching in the university classroom, um, to bring out, right? And we're going to talk about this in a little bit. The sort of Song Dynasty, the specifics of the Song Dynasty history that this book came out of. This book meaning the Gateless Barrier. Let's we'll get to that. But getting students or getting practitioners, to think historically, right? That there's not just the Dharma, right? It's not just the teachings, it's not just the truth or the truth claims, right? But
like
which are somehow
the
which are
timeless
timeless, right?
dharma,
Which are somehow separate from history, but as if they could be, even on a Buddhist case, on a Buddhist way of seeing, if it could be separate from the play of causes and conditions, right? Of which history is one version. But and so really getting into that, exactly how that works on the one hand, introducing that kind of thinking, and on the other hand, introducing or encouraging people to take seriously perhaps a more practice oriented, right? A kind of engagement with the text as it has been and as it is, as it has been in the past and as it is today practiced, right? I think it's, and I don't want to get too much into the other books in the series, but very often when there's a historical study of a text like this one, history sort of ends, right, at some point. And the text as a historical object, dies, I guess. But certainly not the case, as you've just very eloquently put it, right? This text, the Gateless Barrier, profoundly alive, right, today, right? The Lotus Sutra too. I mean, there is some of that in the book on the Lotus Sutra, and there's a very different kind of study of the embodiment of the text, right? That carries it forward to today in that one. But and I think you said multi-dimensional or something. I mean, I'm a kind of Star Trek fan, so I like this idea of the multispectral analysis. I feel like there's something of that going on in this book, and I wonder, you know, is this book a kind of and is your career now a kind of implicit advocacy for those kinds of approaches? It strikes me, if it is, it strikes me as apt and helpful in our moment in the academy where I don't know how you feel, but I feel like things are starting to fall apart around here, in the kind of ivory tower, where we are somehow separate from everything and can consider ourselves to be separate from, the world beyond my windows here. That has that's an idea that's kind of in ruins, partly in some for some good reasons, in part for some bad reasons, not to put this conversation too plainly in history, but we're kind of under attack, right, by our government. But it seems to me that a book like this can take advantage of what is not always a happy situation, right? That we are now exposed to the world, and we cannot this is my own view. We should not imagine ourselves as in some kind of refuge from the world, but we have to make our case, right? Why is the Gateless Barrier worth studying, right? Why is it worth all the money that parents spend on sending their kids to study texts like this? And I think a book like this makes a powerful argument, right? About why it is. This is a living thing, right? This is a text that, if your kids engage with in the different ways that this book is demanding and modeling its engagement, right? Historical, and what's the word? Spiritual, psychological, philosophical, personal, right? That that this gives us a new ground to stand on. I think these are thoughts I have in my dark moments, and I feel like this is a book that can really help us into this new world.
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, I was just recently looking at different grants. If you look at the different grants parameters, it seems to me, maybe I'm reading into it, but it seems to me like Hope Foundation, Lens Foundation, all these different places, they're now they're shifting their focus on academic study, like Buddhist studies, for the sake of Buddhist studies. They are bridging. I don't know if you have noticed this. Like, how does the academic study work in the public sphere? How is it like going to benefit practitioners? So I think that's a trend that's happening, and I think that's a trend that's actually needed. So our expertise as scholars can actually make it relevant to today's world,
Yeah.
opening minds, uh, boundaries. I'm actually writing a grant. I mean, if I were to answer your earlier question, how does it gel, two camps that I'm struggling with? My own research will start to steer. I mean, this is the Gateless Barrier is the beginning. Will start to steer to like the richness of the Han Chinese Buddhist tradition, you know, and the foundation of which is Tiantai and Huayan. If you think about it, Tiantai, Paul Swanson, retired. Dan Stevenson, retired. Huayan Buddhism, Peter Gregory just passed away. It's like, and you ask yourself, who are their successors? It's not like Buzzy has got a whole list of them. I can't think of a single one. That's a crisis.
You mean who engage in those ways, right?
Yes, no,
Doctrine first, in a way.
doctrine first, but also literally, like who did they train? Like academic, like students who
Yeah.
became professors. I mean, when I think about that, I dread because the field has shifted from philology, philosophy to kind of cultural studies to history and thematically organized studies, historically grounded. But then there's no one studying doctrine anymore, except Brooke, right? And some of these other people, maybe in Europe. But in North America, I really feel since my interest is this, I'm going to start studying Huayan. I'm going to translate, annotate texts that directly have relevance to practice, like Ocean Seal Samadhi, Hain Sanmei and stuff like that, and to just flesh it out. And that vision of interfusion, mutual inclusivity, interpenetration, it's the basis of like whole East Asian Buddhism, right? And you see like Da Hui, speaking of the chapter, citing Avatamsaka Sutra, right? And Hongzhi, silent illumination guy, talking, citing the Lotus Sutra. I mean, these people, I don't think like traditional Zen scholars are really paying attention to that. Like they know it, of course they know it in the back of their mind, but They're not really digging out, like excavating, like fleshing out the history of like how did they get exposed to that? Why are they citing that? Because that's the foundation. So I want to present that foundation so that, like this book, practitioners can actually draw from it. Because the reality is, everyone mouth, oh, interconnected, we're interconnected. But no one has fleshed out the doctrinal basis rigorously as people like Fazang, like the full implications of that. And that needs to be translated. So practitioners can draw on it, scholars can start to. What I really want to do is ambitious to really shift the field, not back to philology, but including history. So it's like a three-dimensional picture now. We got our thing about philosophy. We're doing this thing about history, cultural studies, and now we need to blend the two to work on some of these texts so that the visions can be like historicized, you know.
Well, this is what
Yeah.
you do. Um, just a couple of things, I guess. Just personally, I'm glad you brought up my colleague over in the divinity school here. His students, there's a lot of Tiantai love, and they get deep
Yeah.
into that world in that way. I mean, they are philosophers. They have their own style. Um, but again, just a last comment from me on what we were saying before, and I agree. You know, in many ways, right? I miss the kind of the field the way it used to be. I mean, the strict and the powerful historicist movements of the last of our generation, really, and Buzzy's starting with Buzzy in many ways. I think Bernard Four. I mean, that's been powerful. That's been great, but it has left the texts, right? The textual traditions, the traditions of thought. You know, without advocates of the sort that they used to have. And so when you're teaching, I mean, students are hungry for powerful texts, right? Powerful ideas, powerful systems. And you can take them into these YN, Tiantai, Chan, et cetera worlds and really blow their minds, right? And, the more resources we have for that, the better. And again, I think, especially in this moment where the humanities really needs to defend itself, well, we can say, you think the humanities has nothing? Well, look at this. Let's go. Let's get into this stuff, right? Well, I'd like to turn the conversations fully toward the book now, and I think we can follow this path. But so why the Gateless Barrier, right? Why is the Gateless Barrier a text like this, right? That really repays the kind of deep engagement that you're discussing.
Gateless Barrier has always been a really loved text and enigmatic text. And even outside of Chan Zen circles in East Asian Buddhism. So I think that's why in this series that Buzzy is editing, Buddhist classics from India to different parts of the world in East Asia, South Asia, that he chose this this text because this genre of text, like stories of awakening, encounter dialogue, and kind of repartee, like you don't really see in other Buddhist literature. So the richness and the kind of spontaneity uh, of this genre text, of which Gateless Barrier is one representative, is something quite unique in Buddhist literature. So it deserved to be part of this series. And that's why Buzzy chose it. I didn't actually choose it. He just asked me to edit it and to find contributors. So that's the short answer. Um, in Buddhist literature, I mean, dare I say, I mean, I don't know Western philosophical tradition, but I mean, I want to say Gong'an or koan, that genre, it's there's nothing like it. And you can correct me. Like, maybe we'll get to the Plato's
No.
students. Yeah, but about wonderment as the beginning of philosophy, but
We're
that
getting
kind
there.
of
We're on our way there.
yeah, that kind of interaction, encountered dialogue, and this is something quite unique in Buddhist literature, period, maybe beyond it. So this text deserved to be, studied and understood and be part of the legacy of Buddhist literature. Yeah, and plus, this text, as we've been talking about, is alive. People are using it, they're meditating on it, they're contemplating it, they're working through it in relation to their life. So it's very important.
Yeah. Just a quick footnote on the previous thing. I wanted to say too that my book on seals ends with the Hain Sanmei, right, with the ocean seal samadhi. So
Oh,
there is a little bit of that. I hear you on that, and I love that. But leaving that aside, so what so Buzzy Stephen Tyser chose the text for you, but you really run with it. I mean, you make the case for it very powerfully in the book, and one way you do that is, as the best kinds of studies do, you show how doctrine, how thought, and history are really inextricable, right? You can't just say, well, people had these thoughts and they're timeless, right? They're not. In your introductory chapter, no, and also I think throughout your writing in the book, you talk about the ways that the the, the gateless barrier, drawing on and in some ways a kind of resulting from in a historical process, the rise and importance of the figure of Da Hui, who we'll get to, that this was a product in many ways of a much larger movement in China, right? In Chinese intellectual history, where you had in an earlier period a kind of confidence in the literary tradition, right, in the cultural tradition, which in terms of Chan was expressed as what's called Wenzi Chan, right, a literary Chan, or I think you call it the Chan of belles lettres, right, which was and I'm just quoting you here, which required a form of very sophisticated reading, fundamentally, a kind of literary reading. And so earlier Chan Gong'an collections, koan collections like the Blue Cliff Record, they're about reading.
yeah,
They require exercises in immensely sophisticated forms of reading, right? With built upon deep knowledge. They're for various reasons. I don't. You can go into it a bit. We don't have a lot of time, but there's this break, right? Anlushan rebellion, collapse of the Tang, rise of the Song dynasty, whole new ways, eventually a movement towards sort of local cultures. But what you discuss in terms of Chan as a kind of an inward turn, right? A turn away from the vast literary tradition, just to call it that, Buddhist literary tradition, Buddhist textual tradition, towards something else, right? In this inward turn, which ultimately takes the form of huatou, right? I'll ask you to translate that term, right? It can, you know, whereas before the texts were, you go broad, you go wide, you go deep. No longer. Now you drill in on one thing, right? And that becomes a kind of trigger or a kind of object of contemplation, or what? What is huatou, and where did it come from?
yeah. That's the narrative I presented, and I didn't want to get into the messiness, potential messiness of the genesis of Plato, because we do have evidence of, even amidst the literary Chan movement, where all the different new genres of literature arose in the Northern Song Dynasty, Gong'an collections, discourse record, lamp histories, and so on. In the midst of that, you see references to people. They don't call it Huatou, but they call it picking up the phrase, 句phrase. Yeah. Uh, and there's not much talk about it. in retrospect, anachronistically, it's like, I think they're talking about like phrase like these charmers, they're talking about like Huatou, right? And certainly in Da Hui's grandmaster, Wu Zhu Fa Yan, which is uh, Yuan Wu Keqing's own teacher. Yuan Wu Keqing is the editor of the Blue Cliff Record. Like he taught Yuan Wu Keqing that. So Da Hui, I want to say outright that he didn't invent this tradition. It's always been kind of lingering around, part of it. Not much explication in the historical documents about it, but here and there are all these things. But it's certainly with Da Hui, it became something totally different. It became centralized and really amplified. Just because of his charisma and his role in the Chan community and subsequent influences in Korea and and to some extent Japan, uh, and certainly in China, to subsequent influences. In retrospect, he was just a towering figure, and what he practiced was Huatou, outright, explicitly. So Hua is spoken word, Tou is the source of spoken word. So what is it that which before the words, before thoughts arises? That's what it's asking. But in practice, it's a kind of critical phrase. Uh, you could say a punchline within a larger story, and I'm sure you know this, but just for the general audience. So a story of awakening, some tension between people uh, in this encountering through gestures, through words, one of those persons becomes awakened, right? Through some kind of words, turning phrases. And that becomes like the punchline of the whole story. So, so each of these stories have, whether explicit or implicit, these punchlines. And these punchlines is like the juncture of transformation from delusion to awakening. And that, at the working in the practice, is Huatou. So on a theoretical level, it refers to original awakening before delusion arises, before words and language. But on the working end, it's these phrases that people have said that kind of cause this release of delusion, right? And these phrases, they're like over supposedly like 1700 of them. So there's a lot of them. Most famous one is like, some student asked the teacher, Zhao Zhou, does a dog have Buddha nature? Of course, everyone knows all beings have Buddha nature. Why the heck did he even ask that? Right? Putting that aside, so unexpectedly, Zhao Zhou says, no. Well, it's supposed to be yes. Why is it no? So the commentary, the first case in the Gateless Barrier says, this no is not the no of yes and no. So kind of further driving that kind of conundrum. It's not a yes and no. It's not that no. So what the heck is this no? Like what? So it puts you at a halt. It stops the discursive thinking in that state of what I call wonderment, traditionally translated as the doubt sensation, which is confusing for Chinese and East Asians, not only for English. This is not a translation and a loss in translation problem. It's just confusing, doubt sensation. So I translate it as wonderment. So it kind of locks this person into this non-conceptual yet completely vulnerable and receptive openness of mind. And it could be quite focused because you're focusing on that one question. What is the meaning of no? What is u or Japanese? What is mu? Mu de nani ga, right? So it's kind of impenetrable, and yet you want to know. Like that became the shift. Instead of the Northern Song Dynasty focusing on ever more refined layers of commentary, capping phrases, interlinear comments, very literary, as you noted. Dahui just kind of abandoned all of that and just go to the punchline, you know, especially in that inward turn, which Song Dynasty basically conquered by the Jurchens. They took half of the land away. So among the literati, the educated elite class, just in return of, you could say, just grief. You know, it's like Canada taking over half of America. You know, and we can't fight back because they're too powerful. This will never happen, of course. But in the Song Dynasty, right? Uh, so this grief, this inward turn, and this loss of faith in the Confucian tradition, and this turn to find meaning. And Da Hui just basically capitalized on that. He was so entrenched in his network connection with these scholars, this what some scholars call epistolary charm, writing letters back and forth. And Da Hui was very vociferous, so he got laicized, forced, because he got entangled in politics, critiquing the Song government for not fighting back. And he was banished to the south, and he kept up his letter. And that's when he really fleshed out this Huatou practice, right? Responding to whatever you call it, inward turn, grief, and this loss of meaning. And because he was such a towering figure, it kind of shifted the way that Chang expressed himself in the public sphere. Before, great production of literary work. Now, through Gateless Barrier, you see this. It is a koan collection, but it's so different than the ones published previous in earlier part. They are literary and so on. And actually, chapter 7 of this book that I edited, June Wang talks about this phase as the reading craze. And everyone was kind of tapping into it. And plus, why is it craze? Because print culture happened. Printing press was invented. So accessible, all these literary things. And Da Hui just ended up burning that, burning his teachers with block prints because it was so accessible. And he, shifted to this punchline, critical, critical phrase, and really amplified this wonderment in his writings.
I think in the modern, at least popular view, or maybe a large part of the practitioner world, broadly speaking, I mean, it's changed and there are different understandings of it, but what you have described as the Dahui overturning and the Dahui view and what we see in the Gateless Barrier, I mean, that's what Zen is, right? I mean, and the idea that you should read the Blue Cliff Record as a kind of literary text and then contribute your own poems to it, right? Or to understand it as a literary text. I mean, I think that would be a very foreign idea to what people understand Zen to, and I'm just going to use the word Zen here because it's the more widely known one, I guess. But could you say a little bit about how you see that? I mean, how this sort of later Korean and Japanese tradition, as you understand it anyway, where it came from in terms of this story that you're.
Okay, so in China, Chan kept on evolving. As you know, there's all kinds of different kind of Chan expressions. So it just happened that Song Dynasty is of this form, koan. And it just so happens that this is the form that really influenced Japan. So even though in the Zen curriculum, koan curriculum, Gateless Barrier does have a role in it. I mean, my limited exposure to contemporary on contemporary 19th century onward practice of this Zen curriculum in the Rinzai Zen, they're still very much engrossed, embedded in the Northern Song Blue Cliff Record style, in which students have to come up with their capping phrases. Even when there are answer books of capping phrases, they still have to choose the right one to demonstrate their understanding of this particular case as opposed to that particular case. So as they work through the case by case series in this curriculum. So that's not too much different than what the Northern Song Dynasty people were doing and what Da Hui actually abandoned and criticized vociferously. So the Japanese version that they got when they came to Song Dynasty was at that juncture when the Northern Song Dynasty actually fell to the Jurchens, and that's what they brought back. And the great wealth of literature was actually Northern Song Dynasty, Blue Cliff Record, all these different collections, and that's what they kept. Now, interestingly, as Marta Sanvito says in her article, chapter, what chapter is that? Marta is chapter 8. It's actually the Soto Zen people who brought Gateless Barrier to Japan, you know, and really took off their own understanding of it in that culture of secrecy and and that eventually bled into Rinzai Zen and became part of the curriculum in the 18th, 19th century. I'm sorry, 19th, 20th century. Uh, Whereas in China, it kept on evolving, right? So Da Hui stopped doing commentary to koans and so on, just work on the Huatong, and then continue to evolve. In the Yuan dynasty, we see it in Natasha Heller's book, how Zhongfeng Mingben really took off from that. And then in the Ming dynasty and so on, blending with reciting the Buddha's name, as Huatou, who's reciting the Buddha's name, kind of turning the recitation into a question. So that Huatou really took off. On the literary side, in China, it also took off. The rise of Lei Shu, classified text. So this genre provided kind of answer books, large compendiums of answers or approaches on different topics, right? Lei, different class of knowledge. But that also bled into Buddhism. So Buddhist authors start to collect Buddhist classified texts. So they broke up the koans, like one koan, here's a comment, here's a verse. They broke that up into just a case and gathered all commentary throughout history by different Chan masters, different versions of their verses or their capping phrases or their short comments to this particular case. So it's like, as regard to this topic, you have 20 different Chan masters comment. So they start to, so you don't see, that's why in China, you don't see evidence of survival of Gateless Barrier as a single book, not like Japan. Right? So there's this misunderstanding that, oh, it made no impact. It stopped having any relevance. And that's because it exists in the Lei Shu, in the classified text, and you see Woman Hui Kai, the author, and Gateless Barrier cases completely embedded in that, except broken up, along with other hundreds and hundreds of cases, right? And woman's comment is there. So that genre in China, on the part of China, became popular. And Japan, it never became popular. So Japan kept the Northern Song Dynasty. This is one book you work through. After that, you work through this other book. And then after this, you work through this other book in the curriculum. But Korea is different. Korea Buddhism is very close to Song Buddhism. It's very close to Chan Buddhism has always been very close. So they continue the Huatou practice and they continue the classified text genre that they produce as Juan states. So that's how it kind of survived the koan practices and so on in Japan and Korea.
Yeah, it's an interestingly different picture of how a text can be, quote unquote, influential, right? And the way that going against the sort of usual picture. I think we're running late, so low on time. So I'd like to turn to what I think of as what I like best about your your writings on this, and something I found very fruitful, and that's you've already mentioned it, but your translation of this word that's almost always elsewhere translated as doubt, great doubt, as wonderment, right? And so, if you could, why'd you do that, right? Well, what's that? How, can you talk about your vision there? Why do you see
Well,
it that way?
I did that because it's based on actually my personal experience practice. Anyone who works on Huatou or koan, when they work on this, as a spiritual practice, meditate on that, you realize this sense of not knowing, let's just call it not knowing, wanting to know, not knowing, takes on different flavors, takes on the different conditions of where you're at in terms of your body and mind. For example, for beginners, very often, beginners, Zen practitioners, Chan practitioners, very often when they work on Huatou, they become very tense. That's because they don't know how to relax. So it's like a torn wave, tsunami comes. So it's like, moo, moo, moo. That's only one case of this sense of tension, this irresolvability, this kind of impasse. But for seasoned practitioners, or just if you work on it for like 20 years, that way of practicing it's not viable. You can't do it. You can't sustain it. Like for example, Master Xu Yun, empty cloud. Supposedly he was in the Tao sensation for 3 months. You can't imagine he was like for 3 months he'll just die. So anyone working with this was sort of see when the body is relaxed and it's like this qing-an state, this light and pliancy, the kind of semi-quasi unification state. And the doubt is present. The flavor of the doubt takes on the psychosomatic state that you're in. So if you're tense, it takes on the form of this one not knowing, not knowing. If you're in a samadhi-like unified state, it actually takes on that flavor. And that flavor is a kind of awe. It's a kind of wonder, open spaciousness. And it's kind of like this amplified form of open curiosity, of just not knowing. Because the mind itself is kind of vast and open, right? So there are other kind of flavors. So there's a whole array of flavors in daily life. It's just like sometimes I joke around. It's like with my students. It's like I'm sure anyone who does laundry will know this. You put your laundry in the washing machine. You put it afterwards, you put it in the dryer. Originally, when you put it in, there's a pair of socks. You take it out of the dryer, there's like one sock. Where the heck is my favorite sock? So all day long, you're kind of wondering, like, maybe not everyone will wonder about this, but I certainly do. One time, it's like, where is it? Where could it be? So it's like this nagging thing in the back of the mind. You're not really conscious of it. You're still going through the day, but when you're relaxed, when you're kind of nothing to do, it surfaces. It kind of lingers, this unresolved. Another example is like that we know, like when we have a project going, we're not conscious thinking about it 24/7, but it's just in the back of the mind. That's the kind of wonderment, unresolved, irresolvability, kind of stuckness. In Chinese, it's kind of 闷闷的，闷闷的, kind of like stuffiness that you can't. So the Tao sensation or Yi Qing, it's a qing, you see? It's a feeling tone. It's a feeling tone that a mood, a feeling tone, an attitude that pervades through daily life, ideally. And it takes on different psychosomatic states, whatever you're in. So I just started to translate what at the working and the practice, what that flavor is like. And the closest I came up was this wonderment,
Yeah.
sense of not knowing.
All from the Huato, what is the sound of one sock?
Where is that damn sock?
Um, so one of the reasons I like it and I find it so helpful is that it's a it's a word, a site, as we say, where you can do a kind of cross-cultural thinking, right? Which students love. I mean, in my day job here, I teach in the humanities core curriculum, and we teach, among other things, Plato, the Platonic Socrates, and of course, for Socrates, starting in the Theaetetus, right? Philosophy begins in wonder, right? In this word that's translated as wonder, thalma, something like that, where not knowing, right? I mean, it's not, you don't want to say it's the same. It's not exactly the same, but productively, right? What they do with it seems similar, right? Or helpfully similar, in that you get to the state of not knowing, right? For in the Theaetetus, Socrates is talking to his young student Theaetetus, and he says he's going through some philosophical puzzle that can't be resolved, and he just says, I just find this so fascinating. It's a puzzle. Why can't I know? I don't know, but I want to know, right? And he asks Theaetetus, you ever experience this? And Theaetetus says, oh yeah, all the time. It says something like, sometimes it makes me quite giddy, right? He gets so excited. And I think this is a difference from what doubt might do. Doubt doesn't make you giddy, right? Doubt can be difficult, right? It can kind of shut things down, right? Or make it difficult to move forward. Whereas wonder or wonderment, right? There's something productive there. And I just make sure I get it right here. I have I
Yeah,
did the reading, right? He says, so Theaetetus says, "Oh, yes, indeed, Socrates. I often wonder like mad what these things can mean. Sometimes when I'm looking at them, I begin to feel quite giddy." And Socrates says, "Well, just so, right? For this is an experience which is characteristic of a philosopher. This wondering, right? Philosophy begins here and nowhere else, right? In this not knowing. And so again, you don't want to say that Platonic, Socratic philosophy and Dahui are the same. They're not. But there is this profound valuing of getting to this point, right? Of not knowing and then staying with that, right? And then being in that and then working with that, right? And then taking that as encouragement, right? To inquire more deeply. And again, Huato and Socrates, they have different programs, but that moment, right? That's a shared thing, it seems like.
yeah,
I feel comfortable thinking it's a shared thing, from Socratic Greece, Platonic Greece, and Dahui's China.
yeah.
So I'm quite grateful for that.
Yeah, thank you
The
for
word.
bringing that up because that's definitely there's some correlation there. I mean, even when we think about Shakyamuni Buddha, what drove him to leave behind his privileged life, all of his palaces, is this irresolvable fundamental existential dilemma, fundamental question of
Yeah,
how do I alleviate, suffering? And he tried different things. So that's the beginning of everything. Not only philosophy, it's like the beginning of our meaning in life. And I think the difference here is that in the Huatou practice, like you say, the program is different. That's the beginning. Wonderment is the beginning of philosophy, and the program is to inquire. And the method may be to analytical, reflection, contemplation, discursively. And with Chan, they're just capitalizing in that feeling tone of not knowing and building that up. So we don't engage in it discursively. The program is just to kind of feed into this not knowing and familiarize oneself with the depth of this or the abyss of this not knowing. Where does that go? Until the body dissolves, you know, the world dissolves. And that is the juncture from the Buddhist perspective, in my understanding, and an experience, that's the weakest link in self-attachment. So, self is very strong when it's full of defense mechanism, discursive thoughts, discrimination, all kinds. So when all those things start to diminish, engulfed by the sense of not knowing, the self from a fragmented, scattered sense of self becomes concentrated. From a concentrated self becomes unified. And that's the weakest part. And it's at that moment that some catalyst could possibly happen that, you know, the weakest sense of self suddenly drops away. And for the first time, that would be considered Chan awakening or Buddhist awakening. Absence of self. Not that everything's gone, everything's present, except self-referencing is absent. So you're for the first time seeing things with fresh eyes. And that's not through discursive thinking. It's almost like exhausting if I were to, just thinking it through now, wonderment is not only the beginning of things like philosophy for philosophers, but it's the process. You don't want to engage in discursive thinking. You want to kind of hone in on this. And it's that juncture, the threshold, the last bit where wonderment is actually shattered. So in Chan and Zen, we talk about the great ball, right, of the great mass of doubt, right? Or in this case, the great mass of wonderment in which everything is absorbed, sucked into this vortex of not knowing, and which the self-referencing, all the discursive, scattered thoughts completely diminished, where the self has no landing spot, just the sense of not knowing. And when that not knowing is shattered, awakening. So the program, the beginning is the same, but the program, I think that's where it,
For sure. Yeah.
yeah, differs.
The great matter,
Yeah, great matter.
where it begins.
But I'm so happy you brought on this because after I came up with this translation, my colleague in my department actually, uh, he mentioned to me Theotetus. I was like, who? And he mentioned, well, actually, that's you know,
I think it's
the
right.
beginning of philosophy. I was like, who said that? I was like, so he showed me. I was like, oh my goodness, this is great. Yeah. So,
Well, this has been great, and I've certainly enjoyed it. I think,
yeah,
and I feel confident that audiences will get a lot out of it.
yeah, it's so fun to speak with you. And I hope this will spark more conversation in classrooms, also in the Buddhist circles. And I hope people will read this book and just with an open mind. I know traditionally, like Zen folks, Chan folks, only depend on words and language, just do it, practice. But some of the chapters, like Robert Sharp's chapter, Jim Park's chapter, the philosophical readings, it's not what, like Jim, it's not what, but it's how, the process of finding out the truth. It's kind of like what we've been talking about, the wonderment, but just opens up new conversations, you know. Yeah,
Great chapter.
yeah,
And there'll be more interviews with each of them, right?
yeah.
So
Every contributor has another interviewer, another scholar, and it's matched kind of. So stay tuned.